It's going to be like a Charlie Chaplin film, isn't it? You ready? Oh, that was very simple. The first thing that I wanted to do was to be a flyer. I wanted to join the Air Force and be a flyer. And my mother was a very dominating woman, as you might imagine. And she said, oh, no, you know, that's too dangerous for my little boy to become a flyer. And I said, okay, well, the next choice I had, I said I would like to be a farmer. I said, oh no, that's much too hard work. You know, all her parents had been farmers, and she'd been brought up on a farm, and she'd had the hard work of a farm, and she didn't want this tiny little boy, who was supposed to be a very delicate boy, not to be a farmer. So I said, okay. And the next thing that I discovered, and you wouldn't believe this, but at 17 years old, I met a guy who was in an art school. And I didn't know that there was such a place as an art school when I was 17. That was incredible. So I went back home this day and I said, okay, Mum, I've decided I'm going to be an artist. I said, oh, no. You know, to be an artist in those days was to be something less than normal, and to be some kind of evil, rubbishy sort of thing. You know, the artists, they were the people that went in brothels and did all kinds of nasty things. They were never gentlemen. So I said, well, Mummy, you know, the third time, I must do this. So I said, well, I'm going to be an artist. And that's it.
As a practitioner, he was a painter, but he was interested in tapestry, in murals, and he held to the view that an artist wasn't just necessarily a one kind of discipline chap. I held exactly the opposite view. I incline to that view to this very day. And the fact that we don't meet very often really doesn't mean that if we did meet more often, we wouldn't argue about the same principle, and that would keep it alive.
But this one here, this is something to do with this figure. This is to do with Mexico. And oh, you have to cut this one out, I'm afraid. Because in Mexico, they mail people. They put feathers in the right place in order to entertain the ladies. And that's what this fellow's doing. He's got a beautiful headdress, but the headdress is really, it's not in the right place. I made a mistake. It should have been in the other place. And he's entertaining the lady. So this is a Camargue.
It's basically a sort of life history. As far as, I mean, the first painting, I think, is 1936, right up to 2 weeks ago. So, I mean, you've got a wide variation of styles, of themes, attitudes. It's going to be quite interesting because there's a lot of different phases he's gone through, and some of them come back again and some of them don't. You know, some of them have just been a trial period to get a certain attitude, a certain atmosphere, and then other ones have been to get just purely a blend of colour and things, more a design rather than a painting. So could be very, very interesting indeed.
All right, I must admit it. When I draw in pubs, I draw lots of heads and lots of people, especially when they're not aware of what is happening. I think if you get a model sitting for you, it's extremely difficult because they try and put on a face, you know, or they try and put on their personality or what they would like you to see. But if you draw in a pub when people are unaware of what's happening, then you can get them the real self, the real personality that they have, and it comes out much, much nicer. I applied for the Royal and I applied for Edinburgh, and I got into both. And because Hendrik was building Liverpool Cathedral windows for, you know, Charles Gilbert Scots Cathedral, he was the man who was really important in life. So I said, stuff London, I'll come to Edinburgh. Oh, he was a magnificent man. He always had tears in his eyes. He was all very watery eyes. He could drink like a fish, and he could paint like an angel. And he did some beautiful women. And in those days, he was the head of the design school. And the stained glass department was a part of his duty, just a part. And we used to see him, the students, an hour once a month. And he would come down to see us and discuss what we were doing. And that's all the tuition we got from him. But he went away to his studio, which is the painting school, you know, the painting where they prepare canvases and things like
mine
that.
is on
And that was the stained glass room, where all the Liverpool Cathedral windows were built. And John Blythe worked with him. Pritchard worked with him. I worked with him just a little bit, not too much, because I was a bit late on the scene. But he used to take in postgraduate students, and they would work on the windows. Now, Pritchard, poor old Henry, such a fine man. When Lyon came as principal, he decided that Henry should do some lectures for the second year. And Henry said, you know, I've never lectured in my life, and I'm certainly at 63 or whatever he was. I'm not going to do it now. And so he got the sack.
Cocteau. Cocteau was painting a mural in Menton in the town hall. And we thought, gosh, let's go and see what it is. And we found a very aged man, dangerously poised high up on a ladder, painting this mural, and he had his sketches there. And we got to know him quite well. So well, in fact, that he disclosed on a day that Cocteau was going to arrive, and he would come about 8:30 in the morning, and he was going to come to do a bit of work and then disappear. So we got up bright and early, and we were standing on the pavement, pretending not to be too near, and after a while, Cocteau arrived. And he was dressed all in white. Beautiful white Panama hat, white suit, white shoes, white buttonhole flower. And I got a shock of my life, and I looked at Sax, and he looked at me and thought, he can't be going to be doing much painting in that gear. And he didn't. He posed on the top of the step. He went in and had a couple of words with the old boy, and he probably said, ça va bien, oh bien, très bien. And he was off. But we got a glance at Cocteau, and we didn't learn very much more about it. But nevertheless, we were able to go back and boast. Probably we didn't tell the truth in those days. I would imagine that we said we had quite a long conversation with Cocteau and put the world of art to rights.
I had, after my examinations and things in Huddersfield, we had a drawing exam, and that was 2 years of drawing and nothing else but drawing. And I did it in 18 months, and I came out top in the whole of Yorkshire. So I was no end of a guy. I thought I was really quite something. And I came up to Principal Wellington and showed him my folio, you see, and he looked at it and he sort of studied it over, and he knew perfectly well that I thought I was just the bee's knees. And he said, he looked over his half glasses and said, now Shaw, is there nothing you'd rather do than this? This was a revel, and Janet had a boyfriend who was a cripple. Can't remember his name. Roland, I think. However, about midnight, this boy came, John Boland, that was his name. John came to me and he said, now would you take Janet, would you look after Janet? And this was the first revel that I went to with Maisie, when I'd taken Maisie to the revel. It was the first meeting, you know. And I said, okay, yes, I'll look after Janet. And so Maisie was slightly put on one side, and I looked after Janet, and I took Janet home, and she lived in, I think, Royal Circus somewhere. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, we knocked at the door. No, we didn't knock at the door. I said, well, you know, where's your key? She said, oh, I've forgotten it, I haven't got it. And I said, well, just knock him up and get in. He said, no, I daren't do that. So I said, well, you better just come back to my digs. So I took this girl back to my digs. And we sat there in the digs until 7:30, which was my usual time for getting up there. And I went through to Miss Robertson. And I said, Miss Robertson, would you mind preparing 2 breakfasts this morning? And she said, yes. And I said, it's all right. She's a minister's daughter, and, you know, we had this problem. She couldn't get in, and I brought her back. And she said, but Mr. Shaw, ministers' daughters are the worst.
Well, it's more with him, I think. He's a natural teacher. And it's more to do with empathy, I think, between teacher and student. And that's why he gets on so well with students. He has a natural affinity for the student approach to life. And I think he's a perpetual student, in my opinion. I mean, that's the great thing about him as a teacher. And he's one of the few teachers that one can say, and I know many of students we now have in the School of Design, as former students, have said the same thing, that he was the one teacher that they had, that they remember what he actually taught them. So often it all goes into subconscious, but a lot of things he had to say and a lot of things he had to demonstrate have remained on the conscious level of one's own work, and one has to acknowledge this, you know, quite clearly. It was Sax's influence that dictated certain things which one did subsequently. At that time, coming down to get drawing lessons with him, I was constantly aware of what was going on. So a lot of, you know, the effect of his work and his involvement, I suppose I picked up by osmosis. And this was also useful education, not just the drawing. I never did actually learn to draw properly. He did make an improvement on the standard, but I think even he began to despair that I really couldn't draw. Certainly not to the standard he could, but I did improve my watercolours because he had a marvellous technique, which he should really write a book about at some time. His watercolours, which he doesn't do very much now, at least he doesn't exhibit them, were splendid, particularly a series he did of Venice, which I recommend to anybody if they can persuade him to open his portfolio and let him see them. They really were first class, and he did exhibit these, but he ought to do more. He ought to go back to Venice. One of the things he ought to persuade you to do is travel a little more, in a way. But as far as the commissions were concerned, there was also involvement with the Coventry Cathedral with Basil Spence. He'd known Basil for many years before the war, when in fact I think they overlapped in a sense when Basil was practicing in Edinburgh and Sax was a student. There's some connection, no doubt he in fact has talked to you about this. But he was involved in the initial stages of designing the tapestry at the Dovecot for Coventry Cathedral. But the problem was that when I had to pull down about 3 walls or so, and the whole building probably would have collapsed because of the large size that was involved. But Basil Spence certainly intended that it should be done in Edinburgh, and Sax was at that time the director of the Dovecot. So I saw bits of the Graham Sutherland, you know, design, which I never liked, neither did Sax, I think. But it was finally, as you know, woven abroad, which was a pity that it couldn't in fact been done in this country, and I think Sax was quite disappointed that it was not. Because, in fact, Sutherland's tapestry, unfortunately, was not interpreted, which has always been a strength of the Dovecot, that they can take a picture by an artist, a painting, a design, and through a sort of metamorphosis they create the final tapestry, which is not an identical copy of the painting. Now, I think at Coventry, the great problem there was that the weavers simply took the picture and made it into cloth. And it doesn't look as if it's a tapestry, it looks like a big painting, and therefore lacks some of the qualities which a tapestry ought to have, which certainly would not have happened had a Sutherland design come to Edinburgh. But Sutherland, in fact, I think, was anxious himself to have a facsimile of his picture, and he didn't really understand properly, in fact, what happens to a design once it's developed as a design for tapestry by the weavers.
Yeah. Well, they were doing, at that time, they were doing a Matisse panel, which was a rather nice one. They were doing a Loursay panel, but by and large they were doing fairly traditional pieces for French embassies in different parts of the world.
Uh-huh. Who was the actual director of the Gulbenkian at that time?
Oh dear, I cannot remember that. No, I can't remember his name. But he was a very interesting man because he had a little studio and he was working on a small loom, not unlike the one that's in the other room. And he was doing a very tight weaving of a landscape in very small pieces. I suppose no shape was bigger than a thumbnail, and he was ruttling it to give a kind of texture to it. And from this guy, it was the first time that I thought that texture should come into tapestry. Prior to this, all tapestries were kind of smooth, hard finished things. Like there's a little bit on the end of that bookcase there that you'll see how we used to do it. And he introduced a kind of textural thing into it. And, you know, nobody's ever heard of the man, which is a great pity. Because it was a fine little tapestry then. I had seen an exhibition in Paris of tapestries, of Loursat, Matisse, and all the important people, Picasso. And here was a kind of new thing, as opposed to all, you know, things like the Lord of the Hunt and all the Skeir Cummings things. And I wanted to bring a kind of new life into it. And that was my intention. But also my intention was to bring in what I'm doing in my own tapestries, some kind of textural thing, so that wool is a medium of its own, not a copy. So many tapestries in the past, so many glass windows, have always been a copy of painters. Now, this is absolutely wrong. You must, I'm sure you must think of either glass or wool as a medium in itself. And with wool, it's got a special kind of quality that, you know, you can do beautiful things with it because you're using light in a kind of reflected manner. Now, it mustn't be a flat thing. It must have a textural quality as well in order to collect the light. When you're working with glass, in a similar fashion, the light is coming through the glass. And this is a different medium again. You're working with the sun and with light. And this is your medium. And you must understand it, I think, as a medium, not as something to be copied. And this is what is an absolute disaster. So many painters think they can make stained glass windows, they think they can do tapestries, and they will not accept that it is a medium in its own right. You know, the quality of wool, the quality of glass and sunlight are so much more important than just sticking up a painting and painting it in a north light and saying, well, okay, then you light it as you will. They're not working with the real things. I don't think. Every painting that one does has to do with sex. It's either complete frustration or complete fulfillment. So you work out on painting. You know, painting is so sexual. It's always sexual. You paint out what you can't fulfill for one reason or the other. Not because you can't fulfill it, but maybe you don't. Because you're brought up in a puritanical way. You have to work it out on paintings or tapestry. And I'm sure this is right. I did that in the tapestry place to show them how it should be done. I think it's quite a good one, that.
Yeah, I think so.
He painted, I think he had the audacity to suggest to me that he would paint a mural in my cottage, because this cottage was a button bin. And I got it just after the war, when the idea of going into digs wasn't a good idea, and I was waiting for the moment when I would get married. I might tell you I had some curious adventures before that moment came with landladies and other bits of digs. But I got this cottage, a button bin. I had a Morris 8, which with going downhill with a following wind could touch about 35 miles an hour. And we went out of some hilarious sort of foursomes in this thing. But he said he would paint me a mural. And you know what a button bin is like, a box and a half. And I thought, well, he'll try out a bit of technique here and there. Not a bit. He set about a great major event. And in a little room, this mural was the biggest thing around. You know, it was in direct competition with the Pentlands, which were just adjacent. And I thought, what a damn cheek, you know, taking this presumption. And of course it wasn't. It was a great big, serious, not joke, but exercise, because Sax was just obviously trying out the whole potential. And we lived with that mural and got to like it.
It is, because it puts strains on him and it puts strains on me, because one, I don't sort of treat him like a boss, because, I mean, he's my father, so stating the obvious, but and I think he expects me to do it as a job of work rather than treat him as a father, which gets very confusing, because there are other times when he doesn't really treat me like an employee, you know, sort of, and these kind of situations bring about all sorts of little difficulties, you know, sort of. But generally we work quite well together. I mean, I've also got, I think, quite a good knowledge of his colour sense for stained glass, so that helps a lot. I mean, very rarely, you know, when I'm building a window for him, he very rarely has to change a piece of glass that I've cut. It's usually what he's had in mind. Got asked to design a poster for Marcus, and with that he worked, you know, just away with, because he had a great interest in the theme of the poster and the atmosphere of flamenco guitar and things like that.
A difficult boy, Marcus, because he's such a gentle person, and if you're going to play flamenco, you've got to be a wild gypsy to do it. And he doesn't quite have that kind of nature. However, we'll make the best of him. Oh, yes, he plays beautifully. He's much better than Paco Pina. He's got more, I think, gentility about his soul. A little bit more duende, as they call it.
I would only be a spectator. I'm not quite sure. Possibly I'm being a little presumptuous, but I would honestly be expressing a private opinion of a certain sadness that I didn't see more of Maisie's work. She was an enormous support, is, to Sax. And I think that the dialogue that they must have at a creative level could possibly be one of those almost near perfections when you have all the anticipatory dialogue, the building up of mind images, and Sax, in fact, being the practitioner. And therefore, a lot of Maisie's ideas, and I would say this, I'm sure without offense, were channeled into a good deal of what Sax was doing, and vice versa. But there they stayed with Maisie to fill the next idea, rather than to become an artifact, with one exception, and it's a very important one. I would imagine the bulk of Maisie's creative force, not energy necessarily, was placed at the service of those dozens and hundreds of young children who just lifted off in her classes.
She backs him up quite a lot. I mean, she'll sort of, Sax will quite often sort of say, well, is this quite a nice painting or is it a load of rubbish? And she'll sort of give her opinion, and usually a very truthful one. If it is a load of rubbish, she'll say it's a load of rubbish, which doesn't stop Sax from thinking it's good himself, but he'll still, you know, he'll think about it. Also, there's various little things that she does which are difficult to put your finger on, but she does sort of back us up, and she's helped putty a window before now when we've been in a hurry, which is...
These three people, now those Cruikshank, Lutit and Gordon, and these were grown men. They had come back from the war, 1916, and they were under the Marquis, and the Marquis, as I said, he used to come along and say, well, we'll have some trees in this landscape. And they were working on a warp which was about 17 warps to the inch, which is a very fine warp. And in 6 months' time, you can maybe do, what, about 6 or 7 square feet. And the Marquis would come along and say, who told you to put those trees in? Take them out. So the next 3 months they would spend taking out all the work that they put in the previous 6 months. And these people were kind of, you know, very depressed in every kind of way. When you put a lot of work in and then you're told to take it out, and then the following week he would come along, no, the following 6 months he would come along and say, what happened to my trees? Let's have them back in again. So these were the boys that I took over when I became director, you know, apathetic to a degree. They didn't want to know. Here's another guy coming along who'll probably do the same as the Marquis did. So it was a kind of very uphill struggle, trying to get these men to push it a little bit. And one of the most amusing incidents was I did a small panel which was an alpha and omega sign, and this shows the state or mind of these people. This guy had been weaving for a week. Now I left him for 2 days because I was only 2.5 days a week. I was teaching at the college at the same time. In 2 days he was weaving away. And I went to see him, see how it's getting on, and I said, you know, what happened to the cross piece in the A sign? You know, you got an A with a cross piece. And this guy had woven away and forgotten all about the cross piece in the A. So that was the kind of people that I was working with. The other thing was that I had to do all my tracings, all my panels then had to be, I had to make a tracing and I had to put in a colour number to every little section of the tracing, a little bit like cut line. And every number and every colour was put in, exactly, because they wouldn't select from a colour cartoon. So everything had to be ordered. It was a great mistake. Well, the reason why I left the Dovecot, it was kind of mutual arrangement, but they wouldn't produce, there's a panel in the other room there, the one that's in the frame. They wouldn't produce that. They wouldn't let me do it. And I said, well, okay, I wanted to do this kind of work that I'm doing now, which was quite different from the Dovecot's work. And they wouldn't have that. And at the same time, I was beginning to get in commissions from other people from London, like Graham Sutherland and Nicholson and others, And I wasn't too interested in doing other people's work, because they were all painters, and they weren't thinking in terms of tapestry. So I thought, well, it was time to stop and get my own studio going. Well, I worked for Basil Spence in my postgraduate year, in the Enterprise Scotland exhibition, I forgot the name, 1939, I'm not sure about the date. And he asked me to do a mural decoration, which I did for him. And then we got involved with the Coventry Tapestry, and with Graham Sutherland and Basil. And while I was at the Dovecot, I was supposed to do that tapestry. And I asked them £25,000, I think, to do it. And the reason why I had to ask that money was because I had to build a loom, I had to design a loom which was 75 feet long, that would support a tapestry which was going to be about 2 tons if it was going to be woven properly. So my £25,000 wasn't out of order. However, they didn't like that, and they went to Filettown Brothers in Aubusson, and they got it for £12,000. But they got it for £12,000 because the French government subsidised them, because the French government wanted the largest tapestry then to be constructed. So they subsidised them. And they also wove it the wrong way. Instead of having a loom 75 feet long, which was the height of the tapestry, which is what it properly should have been, they did it the other way round, on 35 feet, which meant all the warps are the wrong way round. And serves them bloody well right.
Some other commissions that you had?
Wait, no. When the tapestry arrived in Coventry Cathedral, it was already 4.5 feet longer than it should have been, because all the weft threads are flowing off the warp, which it wouldn't have done if it had been done the right way. And Basil and I were in the cathedral at this time, and it was a time when they were putting the spire on with a helicopter. I don't know if you know about this, but there was a great splash. We had a helicopter to put a spire on the top of the cathedral. And the cathedral was empty, except for Basil and myself. And the tapestry was up. And Basil and I walked down the aisle, and I said, well, okay, Basil, what's it about? He said, well, Sax, it only cost £12,000. And I said, well, that's all it's worth, isn't it? Graham Sutherland was very funny too, because he had a photograph like these up here. He had a photograph of his painting, which was that high. 75 feet, mind you, that high. So it was blown up to 75 feet. And the pencil lines were 1/2 inch thick, where he cross-sected. And he painted it on brown paper, and there were lots of brown paper spots on it. And when I went to him, I said, well, you know, what do you want me to do about these brown paper spots? He said, oh, it's got to look like a Graham Sutherland painting, you know. I said, but it's got to be a tapestry. So he and I didn't get on too well. And I took the photograph down, which was an enlargement, and the Christ's head was about, well, that size, I suppose. And we spent the whole afternoon, or he did, on the floor of Basil's house, the dining hall. after we'd had, what the hell was it? Oh, it was rice and a bit of sausage and something like that. Oh, what do you call it? Not a lasagna, an Italian, a risotto. No,
Risotto.
risotto. And Basil, poor soul, he said, my wife makes a beautiful risotto. And, you know, at this stage, Basil had just got the cathedral and it was £2,000 overdrawn. I didn't know where the next penny was coming from because nobody gave him any commissions because he had the cathedral and everybody thought he would be too busy. And the poor soul was absolutely poverty at this stage. However, after this meal that we had, we spent the whole afternoon, Graham Sutherland on the floor with a pencil, trying to draw in the Christ figure, trying to make the head look right. And at the end of the day, he said, oh, no, you know, I can really only draw on a small scale. I can't draw on a large. He used to come along and buy a tapestry and then build a house for one of his friends. And one of the most annoying things, Ryan, was that he bought a tapestry from me for about £300. And then he built a house and he put a wall up to put the tapestry on. And he spent £1,000 on the woodwork for the hall. I didn't like that too much. It's always been the same. I've either been doing tapestries or I've been doing glass. Now, this last 2-3 years, I suppose, it's been glass. Previous 3 years, it was tapestry. Hopefully, the next 3 years will be tapestry as well. I don't know. But it's always kind of seesawed between one thing and the other, and then you get confused in things like wrought iron gates and ladies' gowns for the minister of St Giles.
Ladies' gowns.
Leo Rothschild came about because of James, Professor now, Professor James Dunbar Naismith. Now, James was a student of mine. He came from Cambridge, and while I was teaching in architecture, James was one of my students. And he asked me, he was building a house for Leo Rothschild, and a very fine house too. And what's very exciting about it is that Leo Rothschild, single man, he has an Italian man and his wife looking after him. And this house is designed in such a fashion that the servants, this Italian man and his wife, and Leo Rothschild have exactly the same kind of bedroom. You can move one to the other. They're exactly the same. Which, to me, when I went down there, I thought, well, you know, this couldn't be more proper and more delightful. That Leo looks after his serving people with such grace. Anyhow, he asked me to do a tapestry for them. And this was one, what, about 15.6 by 6 for something to do with the sea, for his dining room. And I said, okay, I'll do it. So I designed this tapestry, and then, having got the design completed, I went down to London to see Rothschild. And, oh, this was an exciting time too. I went in and, I must tell you about the Rolls-Royce one, which is earlier than this, later on. I went down into the, you know, the big offices, all this money flowing all over the place. And Leo came in and said, well, what have you got? And I said, well, there it is. There's the design. And he looked at it, and it was a design based on some underwater sea diving that I'd done in the Mediterranean. And he's a sea diver and a sailor. So he looked at it, and we talked for half an hour, and during this half hour people kept coming in and said, "Oh, Mr. Rothschild," he said, "this man, from California, he wants to know about this deal." And then 2 or 3 minutes later, someone else could come in. "Here's somebody from Russia who wants, about this deal." And it was all going on like nobody's business. Big deals, £500,000 here and there or what have you. And he was very, very good and patient with me, and afterwards he said, "Well, we spent half an hour." And I said, "Is that all right?" I said, "Well, if you're pleased with it, that's fine." He said, "I'm awfully sorry for bringing you all this way down, just for half an hour."
At the time that I've been talking about, is the time of when one built a life, one built a professional life perhaps, one built a very busy academic life. This was all growing, but it was growing on a scaffolding, on a structure that was really not only universally accepted, but seemed to be a pattern that everybody understood. And certainly in those early days we've been talking about, there was no chance, not a hope in hell of getting a one-man show offered by the galleries here. The place where we graduated was in these SSA and RSA exhibitions, where you had to pit whatever you had against with the rest of the world against the critics or whatever. So the subject didn't arise. But I know that Sax has had several one-man shows. I never really ever understood whether he approved of them or he disapproved of them. But it could be that now in later life he can see and be sensitive to the kind of jungle that is almost maintained today, and not want to have any part of that. And that may lead me to try and indicate now with hindsight a pattern that has been extended beyond this academic norm and the scaffolding that I've just referred to, and home in on Sax a little more closely, because he is really within the tradition of a kind of artist with which I've been rather unfamiliar. Absolutely dedicated, but dedicated at two levels, the creative level and what should we call? You could almost call the business nose level, which is the professional level, to know how to handle oneself, to handle the public, to lead the public to an appreciation of one's work, and then display that work with a professionalism about which he was very fastidious. Those who were in academic life and maybe inadvertently or consciously becoming Saturday and Sunday painters, who didn't have to depend on a professional or business establishment created by themselves for their livelihood, tended to think differently perhaps. And Sax has brought to not only his combination, which he's had through his appointments here, but to the time when he probably was more intent on creating a professional establishment and studio. I think that he must have become very aware indeed of the artificiality and the sincerities and all these other things. And now I'm beginning to try and anticipate what it will be like to have a much more open attitude. And he brought to all the things that he did an extraordinary package of enthusiasm, which must have helped the running of his business. Because when talking to a client, I would think he wouldn't hide it. And I'm sure when talking to students, and I'm talking to one in you, you have responded to this kind of, there's no point in doing it if you don't do it with your heart and soul, and if you're going to be doing that all your life, let's give all you've got. And I think he's lived by that rule, and it's made him behave rather differently. He's been a little bit out of pattern, as I see him. Other people might say, well, that's only because you haven't seen enough of him. Fair enough. I would still hold my descriptive point about him. And I think it's marvelous.
Well, he's got a sort of easy. He's sort of more got an easy way with people rather than having a what I'd call a professional attitude. It's, you know, it's just a sort of easy way and sort of puts people at their ease and sort of charms them round rather than anything else. But I think his tapestries are probably the thing he is best known for, and the thing that most people have collected. There's two collectors that I know of. One's Henry Hill in America, and the other one's Rothschild, Leopold Rothschild. And they've Henry Hill actually designed a house around one of Sax's tapestries, and I think he's got 4 or 5 now. So he's very keen on them. But he's better known in America, I think, and for tapestries than he is here. I think generally he's better known as an artist in America. We've had several ideas. None of them have yet come to any fruition, but one was to start up a stained glass school. But as you can gather, it take a lot of capital. The other is to just sort of get a house in the country and just live out the rest of his life doing paintings and an occasional commission and things like that. But I think probably what will happen is he'll just carry on working in the studio and maybe taking on 2 people or something like that.